Blender for Noobs.
Hello, this is Dan Nobles, and welcome to Blender for Noobs, and welcome to Understanding Modifiers in Blender 3D. Now, if you're following along with the course Blender 3D for Beginners, this is Lesson 8 of that course. Now, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the Add Modifier functionality in Blender, and although we won't be able to go through every single modifier that Blender offers, we'll definitely look at a few, one of the most common that is used, and we'll get an understanding of how these are used within Blender in order to modify the models that we create. So let's get started. So now that I have the Blender program open, I'm just going to go to my windows here, and I'm just going to move this window over just so I get a more full screen view. And over on the right where you have your properties window, you'll see this little wrench here, and that is your modifier properties. And you should also see this Add Modifier button. So what are these modifiers that are in Blender? What are they used for, and why are they needed? Well, the easiest way to explain this is to actually use one of them. And we've actually used a few of them on the previous lessons, but we're going to look a little bit more in depth on what you can do with these. So in order to see this, I'm going to create a sphere. So I'm going to choose Shift-A, go to my mesh, and create a UV sphere. I'm going to choose T on my Tools menu. And by default, you probably have 32 segments and 16 rings. We don't really need that much, so I'm just going to change this to 12. And I'm going to change this one to 6. And I'm going to choose T to remove that menu. And I'm going to use the middle mouse wheel to scroll in. And let's go ahead and move this up out of the way so we can see it. And I'm going to tab into edit mode. And while I have the vertex select here, I'm going to come up here and B box select all these vertices at the top. Choose X, delete vertices. And same thing at the bottom. I'm going to B box select these, choose X, delete vertices. So I'm left with something like this. Okay, I'm going to tab back into object mode. And let's say, for example, that we had an object like this and we wanted to add some thickness to it. So for example, we were showing the inside of a capsule or something, and we didn't want it to look paper thin, because right now these faces are definitely, they're nothing but infinitely thin faces. So one thing that you can do is you can tab into edit mode and come in here, and I'm just going to B box select all these top vertices. I'm going to choose E extrude, S to scale, E extrude, and start bringing it down like this. Now I have to scale it out, and I have to try to mimic what I have here as far as the inner shell in order to create some thickness to this. So here's an easier way to do this with modifiers. I'm going to choose Control Z to undo what I just did. And I'm going to tab back into object mode, because when you use modifiers, you want to be in object mode when you apply them, or actually when you create them. So come over to the properties, and I'm going to choose a little wrench here, which is our modifiers. I'm going to choose Add Modifier. Now immediately you can see that they're arranged into 4 categories of different modifiers. And just to give you a general idea what these are, the Modify category actually adds some functionality, or in this case, actual modification to your object. The Generate category will actually add additional geometry to your object in order to create, or take away, depending on what it's doing, in order to create or modify your object. The Deform category will do just what it says. It actually allows your objects to be deformed in different ways, not necessarily adding additional geometry, but changing the actual visual look of the object that you're creating. And then you have the Simulate category, which has more to do with the physics and animation of modeling, where you can do things like create an explosion, do a fluid simulation, create an ocean, smoke, and that sort of thing. So in this case, I'm going to go to the Generate category, and I'm going to choose this modifier called Solidify. And as soon as I do that, you can see there's been some change, but it's not really readily noticeable. But when you go to your modifier properties, you can see that you have quite a few properties here. And depending on what you're doing or what effect you want, you can change some options here. So I'm going to change the thickness. And when I do that, you can really see what the Solidify modifier is doing. It's basically done exactly what it says. It solidified the object so that now instead of just this thin shell, we have some thickness to the object. So what is the advantage of having modifiers like this do this sort of thing to your modeling object? Well, for one, it's creating a nice, quick way to create modifications to your model that is usually something that is done quite often, some kind of function that is sought after or done often enough in order to warrant a modifier. Another benefit is being able to change your object in a way in order to see what it might look like if you apply this modifier to it and not have to worry about destroying your original object. So for example, if we look at this modifier, we have some options up here. And in this case, once we render out this object, it's going to include this modification, but we can turn this off if we want to. So if we did a render of it right now, we wouldn't see this thickness. We can also change the visual look of the modifier, turn it off and on here. So if we turn it off, we can see how our original object looked before the modification. We can also use this option here to show the modifier effect while in edit mode. So if I tab into edit mode, right now we can see the modification, and if I turn that off, we just see the original object there. So I'm going to tab back into object mode. One of the nicest aspects of being able to add these modifiers is to make these changes to your object and not worrying about, like I said, if you made a mistake or you didn't like the effect that it did on your object, you're not stuck with a modifier. You can always come over here and choose X to delete the modifier, and you can be back to your original shape. Now, unfortunately, if you go and you apply the modifier, that means that it's going to apply exactly what you had, and if you don't have the levels of undo to bring it back, then you're basically stuck with that change that you did. So if you tab into edit mode, you can see that all that excess geometry that we created is actually there, and that's what we have. So I'm going to tab back into object mode, and I'm going to choose Control-Z undo a couple of times so that we get our modifier back here. Now another thing you'll see on the modifier panel is we have an expansion arrow, so we can choose that. We just want to see the basic panel that's there. And that's really if you have a long stack of modifiers, you might want to use this. Another thing that you'll see is the possibility to move the modifier up and down in the stack. So for example, if I choose add a modifier, and in this case I'm just going to choose subdivision surface, then if we wanted to, we can come down here to subdivision surface and we can move this ahead of the solidify modifier. Now the modifier's position in the modifier stack does affect how your final object is rendered and how it is affected. So when you're using more than one modifier and something's not looking quite right, you want to make sure that you have your modifiers in the correct order in the modifier stack. For example, if you're using the mirror modifier and you're also using the subsurface modifier, generally you want to apply, or I shouldn't say apply, but you want to have the mirror modifier first in the stack and then followed by the subdivision surface modifier. And that's just something as you work with your different models and you use the different modifiers, you'll begin to get an idea of the order of some of these. And in many cases, the order won't really matter that much. Just something that you should keep in mind as you work with these modifiers and you have more than one in the modifier stack. And sometimes you can also logically think about how these are being applied. For example, we had the subdivision surface first right now. So what it's doing is it's taking our original object, which if we turn off this here, it's taking this original object, it's applying that subdivision surface, and then it's going on to the solidify, and it's adding that to something that's already been subdivided. So if I take this and I move it down, in this case, it's applying this solidify to it, and then it gets to the subdivision and it takes that entire geometry and adds the subdivision surface to it. Now in this case, it doesn't matter too much, but like I said, just something to keep in mind as you work with different modifiers in your modifier stack. And one other thing to keep in mind, generally when I'm working on a model and I'm using modifiers, one of the very last things I do, and I'll save a different version, like a final version of my model, is I will start to apply the modifiers. That way, once I take the blend file and I share it with somebody, or if I want to export the blend file, then those modifiers have already been applied and really don't have to worry about them. However, usually on the subdivision surface modifier, I will keep that intact. I'll leave it there. I will not apply it, just for the fact that it allows these subdivisions to be changed. So in other words, if I went up 3 levels here, which is very high for this, but say if I made 3 subdivisions and I applied this, so for example, if I go ahead and apply and I choose tab into edit mode, I have all this geometry. But say for example on my original object, somebody got the file and they really didn't want that many subdivisions in the object. They didn't really need it to be that smooth. Then it would be nice for them to have that modifier intact so that they could change the amount of subdivisions. So I'm just going to tab back in object mode, choose Control-Z to bring back the modifier. So we'll pretend that I left the modifier intact and maybe I applied the solidify, but now I can change this back to whatever I want it to be. But again, as you work with the different modifiers and understand their different functionality, you'll know whether you want to go ahead and apply them or keep them for future changes. So I'm going to choose Control-Z and bring back the solidify modifier. Go ahead and bump this back down to 2. Choose T for my tool menu, and I'm going to choose smooth shading. Choose T to remove that menu. So now we have a subdivided surface here that has been solidified, and of course we can make it thicker if we need to. Another thing we can do is add another modifier, and let's look at this time. Let's look at the edge split modifier. And what this does is it adds hard edges to areas where the angle is changing. So if we look at this, we see it set at 30 degrees. We can actually change that. If we go too far, there's no angles that is really that wide, so it's not really being applied at all. So come down and change that back to the lowest. It's seeing all those different angles in the faces, so it's actually applying that edge split to those different faces. So let's bring this back to 30. So this is a nice easy way to add that hard edge to areas where you might want it, depending on the angles that you have in your object. So there's an example where we might use 3 different modifiers within our stack. So let's go ahead and look at some of these different modifiers, and I'll just run through some of the most popular ones that are used. So for example, array. If you were taking this course, you probably looked at the last lesson, which was on NURBS and curves, and we used the array when we created 2 links in a chain. Instead of trying to duplicate those manually to create a chain, we use this array modifier, and what that allowed us to do is automatically create a number of links, or really any number of links that we wanted to for our chain. We have a bevel modifier, and what that does is just adds a bevel to sharp angles. So for example, if I come over here and I'm going to do a Shift A and create a cube, and I'm just going to move this up where we can see it. Make sure it's selected, choose Add Modifier, and I'm going to choose the bevel modifier. You can see that it's adding a bevel to our edges there. And again, you have many options that you can change in order to change the way this reacts. So on the width, if I change that, you can see how that might change. And the number of segments, which is really the number of bevels that it is adding between those beveled edges. So go back to Add Modifier. We've seen how the edge split works. The mirror modifier is heavily used. It's for basically if you are creating a model that is the same on both sides. Say for example, if you're creating a car, you'll use the mirror modifier in order to duplicate and mirror the geometry. So when you're modeling on one side of the car, everything that you do to that model is mirrored to the other side. So basically making your work twice as fast. Very heavily used. We saw how the solidify modifier is used. We also looked at the subdivision surface, another very, very, very heavily used modifier. We also have something that is fairly new to Blender, and that's the wireframe modifier. And this allows you to actually work with the wireframe geometry of your object. So for example, if I chose wireframe, we can now see the actual edges of the object. And this is very useful if, for example, you actually want to render only edges, because when you render an object in 3D, you don't normally see edges or see vertices. If you have faces, that is basically what is causing the light to hit the object and render the object. But your actual edges, physical edges that you're working with within the modeling program, you don't normally see that at all. So this allows you to see it. So, of course, one good use of this is if you create a model and you want to show the topology of what you created, show the mesh, show the edges and all of that, then you can use this modifier in order to render out that, which is really nice. So I'm just going to delete that one, come back to add modifier. And under the deform menu, we have armature, which has to do with creating a sort of skeletal structure for a character so that you might be able to move the character around and create animation, very heavily used. You've seen how we used the curve modifier when we worked with it in the last lesson. If we move over to the simulate menu, we have cloth, which, as you might guess, simulates the way cloth reacts. Say if you created something like a blanket and let it fall over a bed, it would actually let the cloth move over the bed the way cloth might react in the real world. And most of these ones in the simulate do pretty much what you might imagine from the explanation. If you explode, it takes your object, and working with the physics properties, you can actually take your object and explode it into a number of pieces. You can do an ocean with this modifier, create a particle system such as hair or fur, and create smoke, and then you have a soft body modifier. So a fairly large amount of modifiers that you can use in Blender, and they add to this list from time to time, so it really enhances the functionality of Blender. Now, one final thing that I'll mention about the modifiers, say if we go back to our object here. So I'm going to come over to our modifier stack, and I'm just going to delete this edge split modifier. I'm also going to delete subdivision surface modifier. So we're only left with this solidify modifier. And in fact, I'm going to choose my tools menu, and I'm going to change it back to flat shading just so we can see it a little bit better. So let's go ahead and turn off this view for a second. And this is our original object that we had. You can see here that it says 79 faces, but it's actually counting all the faces in our scene right now. It's not just this object, but we know that some of these faces included in here are the faces of this object. So one thing that I don't want you to kind of get an idea with the modifiers is sort of like when you create a modifier or add a modifier, you're cheating a little bit by adding this modifier that's really not there, so it's not really counting against anything. Well, in actuality, if you are going to render with the modifier in place or apply the modifier or whatever you're going to do with the modifier, it does count when you think of the added geometry that you're doing and the added faces. So for example, if I turn this back on, instead of 79 faces, you'll see that we now have 127. So you can see that those faces, even though it's being created by a modifier, are actually really calculated. And it just makes sense. Otherwise, if that geometry really wasn't there, then when you did animation and rendering and all that, all of those sort of things, then you wouldn't actually see it. So probably pretty self-explanatory, but I just think it's easy sometimes to think of these modifiers as something that's outside the calculation of the geometry and doesn't really have that overall effect of it. But especially once you apply the modifier, it's definitely there. And conversely, if you are working on something and you're doing a render of a scene or some animation and you turn off these, then of course, if they're not something that's not needed at the time, then it'll definitely save you in render times and animation times and that sort of thing. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the modifiers and the modifier stack in Blender 3D. In the next lesson, lesson 9, we're going to be looking more into subdivision and smoothing and some of the different techniques that is used in order to improve the look of your 3D model. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.